Okay, so here's some information on the NIST framework. And I think you'll see as we look at this how it relates to some kind of general risk management principles that you might see in the broader risk management literature. So the NIST framework has what's called the framework core, which is the core ideas of what the framework is supposed to do, what it's supposed to cause an organization to think about, a kind of a philosophy behind the framework, and then some tools or some ways of implementing the framework. The NIST framework core is right here on the screen, and I think you can see it's relatively simple, and as I said, kind of common sense. If you look at the left side, the core lays out some functions that an organization ought to be involved in regularly with respect to cybersecurity. The second column would be categories of risk that as you work through the framework and the tool that I'll show you in a moment, you'd identify those categories of risk. Those categories get broken down in the next column into smaller subcategories. And then on the far right column, there are references that provide kind of industry standards for trying to secure and think about the risk related to these functions, categories, and subcategories. And the references will be things like an ISO, an Insurance Standards Organization standard, or COBIT, which is a standard that's widely used in the computer security industry. Different kinds of standards that are published that organizations would have access to, and that would then provide reference, that would kind of provide procedures, take this step, take that step, take this step. So that's the general framework. It's not rocket science, but what it really does is it forces an organization to work through these details, kind of like we did in that tabletop exercise in class, but at a level of a lot more granular detail. So here's what you might call sort of the NIST framework philosophy. And this graphic is from the framework document. And again, it's not really rocket science, but what it's suggesting, and I think one of the most significant things that it's suggesting, is that if you move up from the bottom, the implementation, you see that guy sort of plugging things into a rack server, right? And you move up to business processes, so kind of the line management conducting its business. I think traditionally people thought of computer security, certainly at the implementation level, maybe at the business process level, if the business was engaged in something where security seemed to be critical to the product or service that's being offered. But then above that, to the executive level, and this is really the cultural shift that you're seeing in the industry, and that the NIST framework is trying to promote, that cybersecurity is a C-suite, a CEO level suite, executive level issue. And certainly, as you heard, again, Erez Lieberman talk about, big sophisticated organizations are beginning to treat it that way. And so the idea is that cybersecurity ought to be elevated all the way up to the top of the company. It's not something that just gets hived off into the computer operational level, even though that's the most fundamental level where the day-to-day work happens. So here is an example of a page from the NIST framework tool. And if you actually go to the NIST website and you can download the whole packet, the whole framework, you'll see that the tool is huge. There's pages and pages and pages and pages of this kind of stuff. And so you can see this page just relates to one particular function, the identify function within the framework core. One particular category of managing certain assets, a few particular, 6 particular subcategories there, and on the right you can see all of the different standards that are listed as potentially being relevant and providing information about processes to secure these. So for example, like this one says one of the functions is to identify potential risks. The category here is asset management. What kind of devices, what kind of systems do you actually have? If you look at the subcategories, the first two subcategories are talking about inventory. So do you even know within the organization how many servers you have, what they have, how many desktops are there, how many laptops are out there, how many company-issued phones or smartphones are out there? Do you even have a record of all those things? And of course, I think if you're looking at this, you'd say, well, of course an organization does. But if you've ever been in any kind of sizable organization or even a small organization, I think you'll realize that pretty quickly this gets out of hand. And maybe there are records kind of scattered in various places. Maybe there's no central inventory. The point is, it makes an organization sit down and actually think, okay, we can't just have laptops and phones and other devices out there without knowing where they are, who's using them, and so on. That's just a basic first step. So you'll see if you look at the framework tool itself, there are pages of this. All this, it's called a tool. It's really nothing. It's not really a technological tool. It's a management tool. You can, on the NIST website, download the tool as a spreadsheet file, which is really interesting. So, if you're in an organization that might want to take the tool and apply it, you can take pieces of it or the whole thing if you want, put it in, dump it into a spreadsheet, and then kind of figure out ways to work through different assignments, how to check off when things are completed, and so on. So that's our kind of legal and policy background and the NIST framework, which is incorporated into or referenced in President Obama's executive order. Let's pivot now to some kind of broader risk management principles that people involved in the cybersecurity business on the risk management side often talk about. And I mentioned in class that I recently completed an industry cybersecurity certification, and I took a kind of basic level course in cybersecurity risk management through the SANS Institute, which I highly recommend. It was an online course. It's very, very expensive, but for a lot of people in the industry, they'll go through some of these courses, and it really provided some good basic information, and I'm going to give you some information that I learned in these next few slides from that course that, again, is not rocket science, but I think it really makes you sit down and think about how to make this flow logically and what an organization needs to do to manage this risk.